Nikki with the Center for Neo-Economic Diplomacy, which is part of India-based think tank ORF, Observer Research Foundation. It's my pleasure to introduce my guest today, Rachel Beatty Riedl, who joins us from Evanston, Illinois. She is Associate Professor, Department of Political Science, Northwestern University. She has a joint appointment as Director in the Program of African Studies, also Faculty Fellow, Institute for Policy Research. Her first book, published a few years ago, is called Authoritarian Origins of Democratic Party Systems in Africa. The second one will be out soon on religion and politics. So Professor Riedl, welcome and thank you for taking some time out today.
Happy to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Professor, what drew me to your work is twofold. One is your research immersion itself, but the other equally compelling one is a series of more than 60 podcasts you've recorded for Ufahamu Africa. That's a lot of context right there from a wide range of talking heads. Give us a sense of the dominant themes through which people like us might want to frame our understanding of this collection of 54 countries, which we often call by a single name, Africa.
Absolutely. I have to tell you, I've so enjoyed doing the podcast Ufahamu Africa with my co-host and founder, Kim Yi-Dian. And that's because it's given me such a purview to have access to this incredible set of research. And that's really what we wanted to share with broader audiences. So I think there are three main themes that we keep returning to. And the first of those is really broadly based around questions of inequalities. How citizens are responding to the inequalities they face. And we see these examples through protests, as we were talking with Lisa Mueller about her new book about protests largely based in Niger. We've been covering the protests in Sudan, in Algeria. And so the citizen mobilization around grievances that they have, around entrenched inequalities and how they see those replicated through the political systems and how they're seeking not just to oust a particular leader, a particular government, but really they see kind of broad-ranging structural reform to allow new generations to have opportunities to jobs, to education, to public health services and the like. So a lot of the protest movements that we see are really based around these core structural demands for reform. A second major issue that we have been covering and looking at is really thinking about how the global relates to the local and those intersectionalities. And then a third key domain of research that I think is really key and increasingly weaving through the topics that we cover is related to resilience in the face of environmental change, adaptations that we're seeing in citizens through urbanization and migration.
I'd like to pick on one of the themes that you're talking about. So there are a lot of headlines about Africa, and the shiniest among them usually is how young it is as countries and as a continent. And the median age is 18. I mean, you can cherry pick which headline you want, but what does it mean when all these people are healthy and well educated?
Exactly. So I think there are a couple of different implications of what some people are referring to as the youth bulge. And the first is that the way we see technology and the possibilities of technological innovations being used and picked up is incredibly among this population, among what we might call the youth, right? Under 18, but also this kind of very precarious age of 18 to 30, where people are having their education top out, kind of reach its ultimate level, and then seeking to transition into full-time secure employment, right? That's really where so much of this question of what are the economic demands and what are the political demands that they have. So this population in general is absolutely using technology in new ways. And of course, we see that when we look across kind of North Africa and the Arab Spring, right, being able to communicate around protests. Right now, we've seen major protests in Algeria where 70% of the population of 30 and under is 70% of the population is 30 and under. And so the kind of degree to which that element of the population is at the forefront of the protest is incredibly important. Also in Sudan, we see the same elements right now at this moment. So we see the role of technology in protest to communicate, to document what's happening. We see it in voting accountability, using cell phone pictures and sending messages about parallel vote tally to be able to say, we know in this constituency at the moment of counting, such and such candidate had X percentage, and using those to create parallel vote tallies to hold the electoral commissions accountable. We also see technology and the youth being able to transfer money in new ways. So mobile banking technologies, for example, in Kenya are transforming the citizens' relationship across space. So young people move to the cities, but they can still transfer money back to family that might be in more rural settings and help contribute to a kind of flow, an economic flow that we think about in terms of migration more generally, whether it be in a capital city or internationally. So I think that the youth bulge is obviously, we know that the narrative is linked to questions about demands for employment and translating educational opportunities into employment, but it's also translating into new ways of making those demands.
A lot of your work, Professor, is mainly about how similar African countries have developed very different forms of democratic party systems and the uncertainty that it has led to. What is that doing to society in Africa right now?
So one of the things that I really want to highlight, and I think is so fascinating, is that the way in which the party systems have been structured. So for example, on one hand, you could have a country like South Africa where you have the dominance of the African National Congress, the ANC, since the end of apartheid, and still a high level of contestation as opposition parties endeavor to form a meaningful and significant challenge to the ANC's dominance. So that's one hand where you have, who the main players are going to be in terms of the parties and what they represent, and then they continue to try to build constituencies. Another case similar to that is Ghana, where you have the two parties, NDC and the NPP, very well institutionalized and high levels of contestation between them. Those are kind of what we think of classic levels of contestation, where citizens can vote for a party and they can vote against a party to try to hold that party accountable. On the other hand, we have cases that have developed incredibly fluid types of party systems where new parties are always coming into being. We're not sure which parties might be in the next election and how a certain set of political elites might relate to those parties. So if one political elite, for example, is in the lead, others might bandwagon around them and try to form a coalition to have access to power. So in those senses, opposition is much more fragmented. It's harder to know where opposition lies in some senses. It's harder for citizens to read the parties and how they translate into different types of constituencies over time because they're not as stable. On the other hand, what they do offer is an incredible amount of increasing participation, right? That the barriers to entry to form a new party, to state your ideas, to offer a different vision are not so high. And so we see new types of candidates entering the fray, maybe younger leaders, such as the candidate Sonko in the last Senegalese election. So we see younger leaders contesting. We see different types of what we might consider to be minority candidates representing one constituency or another, entering the political playing field. And so on that front, I think that a less institutionalized party system does offer its own forms of meaningful contestation, to be sure, and some important channels for participation.
One last question, maybe. So if you take a cursory glance at, Africa's achievements, you can see Nobel Prizes in medicine, chemistry, physics, literature, peace. You take Nigeria, for instance, it's built a vibrant film industry. Rwanda has the world's highest percentage of female lawmakers. So what have some of these countries done right? What have they got right Or what have the circumstances, how have the circumstances conspired to get them ahead, which other countries could maybe replicate?
That's a great question. And I think we are always looking for, where are success stories, what are best practices, and how can we think about learning and sharing across spaces. So I think there are two kind of fundamental baseline conditions that are incredibly important. The first is the education system that the country is able to provide, obviously for the vast majority of the population, right? To be able to extend it in terms of space, in terms of the number of children, and then in terms of the time horizons, right? That more and more children are able to go through primary, secondary, tertiary education. So that, that is what a lot of the protests and demands are for, right? So that's where citizens are trying to hold their governments accountable. So there's a win-win dynamic to be had there, to be sure. And governments are grappling with that. And so places where we see high levels of public service provision, particularly in education, but also in the interrelated health domains, right? In terms of healthcare, in terms of access to water, electricity, all of these go together to really allow for the productivity of society to be realized. The second element, and it may be even more fundamental, but certainly closely related, is this balance between order and liberty. And that is to suggest that where there's an absence of conflict, where there is the provision of peace and stability that allows for governments to provide those public services, but also just allows for citizens to realize their own individual potential, be it in artistic domains, scientific discoveries, across the board, that this requires a baseline political context that can allow people to thrive. And I think that is absolutely, when we look at the demands for political reforms, that is also at the base of so many of them. But that drive for order, stability as a foundational element has to be balanced with condition of liberty, again, for each individual to thrive and to find their pursuits, to use their labor in ways that can be really catalyzing and path-breaking. And so that balance, where that is realized, is absolutely critical for all of these wonderful successes that you've highlighted.
Thank you so much, Professor Rachel Riedl, for this conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.